Hello folks, Happy New Year. I just wanted to give a shout out to everybody to let you all know that I'm adding another service to my offerings. In addition to my writing and video services, I'm now available as a voiceover artist. I've been doing voiceovers for my own videos and for some of the ones I've done for clients in the past, but I've never offered this as a standalone service before. However, people tell me I have a nice voice and it's something I should offer, so here it is. I've set up a gig on Fiverr.com to facilitate this service. Here's the URL, and I'll also put a link in the description. Here are some voiceover samples I've done. AI is no longer just a technological advancement. It's a vital component in optimizing and streamlining work processes. Today, we will explore in depth the 5 key reasons why integrating AI into your workflow not only makes tasks easier, but also opens doors to new levels of efficiency and creativity. Reason 1. Automation of routine tasks. The first and perhaps most obvious reason is the automation of routine tasks. AI's ability to handle tasks like scheduling, data entry, and even preliminary data analysis is just the beginning. Imagine AI-driven software that can intelligently categorize incoming requests or inquiries, automatically routing them to the appropriate department or individual. In customer service, AI chatbots can handle initial customer queries, only escalating more complex issues to human staff. This level of automation significantly reduces the workload, allowing professionals to dedicate their time to more strategic and impactful tasks. In 1988, 2 archaeologists reported on a remarkable discovery they had made in a cave complex in the Pyrenees which contained Paleolithic paintings. They noticed that the places where the images were most thickly clustered, some tucked away in narrow side passages awkward to reach, all had one thing in common. If a note was sung in them by the human voice, the sound gave off a resonance more obviously than anywhere else in the caves. These and other Paleolithic paintings are the earliest records we have of the human ability to conjure up images of the world around us, the basis on which we create stories. The pictures they show, of men and animals and even dots apparently representing the monthly cycle of the moon, are the beginning of narrative. And although we do not know why our ancestors around 20,000 years ago should have devoted so much skill to inscribing these particular images on the rock faces of pitch-black underground caverns, the fact that they particularly chose to do so in places where the sound of the human voice reverberates may provide a significant clue. Because when we experience that kind of resonance with our surroundings, we have the sense of being in touch with an unearthly other dimension. Whatever the conscious purpose of these paintings, it seems that what lay behind it was their creators' sense that, in making them, they were in some way being brought into tune with something larger than themselves. On a Saturday morning in late November 1944, in a railway shed in the Dutch seaside resort of Schenvigen, 3 ballistic missiles, each nearly 15 metres long, lay in their steel cradles like cosseted patients in a private clinic, their inspection covers open, hooked up to monitors and tended by technicians in the shapeless grey denim overalls of the German army. That winter, the war's 6th, was notoriously hard. The cold seemed to emanate from the concrete floor, to rise through the soles of even the heaviest boots and penetrate the flesh to the bone. One of the men stepped back from his workbench and stamped his feet to try and keep the blood flowing. He was the only one not in uniform. His pre-war dark blue suit with its row of pens in the breast pocket, along with his warm plaid tie, proclaimed him to be a civilian. A maths teacher, you might have said if you had been asked to guess his profession, or a young university lecturer in one of the sciences. Only if you noticed the oil beneath his bitten fingernails might you have thought, ah yes, an engineer. He could hear the North Sea barely 100 metres away, the continuous rolling crash of the waves somersaulting onto the beach, the cries of the gulls as they were flung around by the wind. His mind was filled with memories, too many memories in truth. He was tempted to put on his ear defenders to shut them out, but that would have made him look even more conspicuous, and besides, he would only have to take them off every 5 minutes, for he was constantly being asked questions about something or another. The propulsion unit, or the pressurization in the alcohol tank, or the electrical wiring that switched the rocket from ground to internal power. He went back to work. It was just before 10:30 that one of the big steel doors at the far end of the shed rattled back on its rollers, and the soldiers nearest to it stiffened to attention. Colonel Walter Huber, commander of the artillery regiment, stepped inside amid a blast of cold rain. There was another man at his shoulder wearing a black leather greatcoat with the silver insignia of the SS. "Graf!" shouted the colonel. "Turn away," was Graf's immediate instinct. "Pick up your soldering iron, bend over your workbench, look busy." But there was no escaping Huber. His voice rang out as if he were on a parade ground. "So this is where you're hiding. I have someone here who wishes to meet you." His high leather boots creaked as he marched across the repair shop. "This is Sturmscharführer Bivak of the National Socialist Leadership Office." "Bivak," he said, ushering the stranger forward. "This is Dr. Rudi Graf from the Army Research Center at Peenemünde. He is our technical liaison officer." Bivak gave a Hitler salute, which Graf made a wary return. He'd heard about these NSFOs, but had never actually met one. Nazi Party commissars recently embedded into the military on the Führer's orders to kindle a fighting spirit. Real die-in-a-ditch fanatics. The worse things got, the more there were. The SS man looked Graf up and down. He was about 40, not unfriendly. He even smiled. "So, you are one of the geniuses who are going to win us the war?" "I doubt it." Huber said quickly, "Graf knows all there is to know about the rocket. He can fill you in." He turned to Graf. "Sturmscharführer Bivak will be joining my staff. He has full security clearance. You can tell him anything." He checked his watch. Graf could tell he was in a hurry to get away. He was an old-school Prussian, an artillery officer in the Great War, exactly the type who had come under suspicion after the army's attempt to assassinate Hitler. The last thing he would want was a Nazi spy listening at his keyhole. "One of Seidel's platoons is scheduled to launch in 30 minutes. Why don't you take him over to observe?" A quick nod of encouragement. "Very good." And he was gone. Bivak shrugged and made a face at Graf. "These old timers, eh? What can you do?" He nodded at the workbench. "So, what's that you are working on?" "A transformer from the control unit. They don't much care for the cold weather." "Who does?" Bivak put his hands on his hips and surveyed the shed. His gaze came to rest on one of the rockets. Vengeance Weapon 2. The V2. "My God, she's a beauty. I've heard all about them, of course, but I've never actually seen one. I'd very much like to watch this launch. Do you mind?" "Of course not." Graf retrieved his hat, scarf and raincoat from the row of pegs by the door. Rain was gusting off the sea, funneled down the side streets between the abandoned hotels. The pier had burned down the previous year. Its blackened iron spars protruded above the running white-capped waves like the masts of a shipwreck. The beach was sown with barbed wire and tank traps. Outside the railway station, a few tattered tourist posters from before the war showed a pair of elegant women in striped bathing costumes and cloche hats tossing a ball to one another. The local population had been expelled. Nobody was about apart from soldiers. No vehicles could be seen except for army lorries and a couple of the tractors they used to move the rockets. As they walked, Graf explained the setup. The V2s arrived by rail from their factory in Germany, shipped under cover of darkness to avoid enemy aircraft. 20 missiles per shipment, 2 or 3 shipments per week, all destined for the campaign against London. The same number were being fired at Antwerp, but they were launched from Germany. The SS had their own operation going in Hellendoorn. The batteries in The Hague were under orders to fire the rockets within 5 days of arrival. Why so rush? Because the longer they're exposed to the wet and the cold, the more faults they develop. There are a lot of faults? Bivak was writing down Graf's answers in a notebook. Yes, many. Too many. Why is that? The technology is revolutionary, which means we're having to refine it all the time. We've already made more than 60,000 modifications to the prototype. He wanted to add that the real wonder wasn't that so many missiles misfired. It was that so many took off at all, but he decided against it. He didn't like the look of that notebook. Why are you writing so much down, may I ask? Are you making a report? Not at all. I just want to be sure I understand. You have worked for a long time on the rockets? 16 years. 16 years looking at you. It doesn't seem possible. How old are you now? 32. The same age as Professor von Braun. You were at the military proving ground at Kummersdorf together, I believe. Graf gave him a sideways glance. So he'd been checking on von Braun as well as him. He felt a twinge of unease. That's right. Bivak laughed. You're also young, you rocket fellows. They had left the built-up streets of the town and entered the forested suburbs. Schwenningen was ringed by woods and lakes. It must have been pretty before the war, Graf thought. Behind them, a driver hammered on his horn, forcing them to scramble to the side of the road. Moments later, a transporter roared past carrying a V2 in its hydraulic cradle. The fins first, closest to the cab, then the long body, and finally, protruding over the end of the trailer, the nose cone with its 1-ton warhead. Camouflaged tankers followed close behind. Graf cupped his hands and shouted in Bivak's ear as each one passed. That's the methyl alcohol! The liquid oxygen! The hydrogen peroxide! It all comes in on the same trains as the missiles. We fuel at the launch site. After the last of the support vehicles had disappeared around the corner, the two men resumed their walk. Bivak said, You're not worried about the enemy bombers? Of course, night and day. Luckily they haven't found us yet. Graf scanned the sky. According to the Wehrmacht's meteorologist, there was a weather front passing over northern Europe that weekend. The clouds were grey, heavy, oozing rain. The RAF would not be flying in this. Further inside the tree line they were halted by a checkpoint. A barrier lay across the road, a sentry post beside it. Graf glanced into the woods. A dog handler with a big Alsatian on a leash was moving through the dripping vegetation. The dog cocked its leg and stared at them. One of the SS guards shouldered his machine gun and held out his hand. No matter how many times Graf attended a launch, it seemed to amuse the sentries to act as if they had never seen him before. He reached into his inside pocket for his wallet, opened it and pulled out his identity card. A small photograph slipped out with it and fluttered across the road. Before he could move, Bivak had stooped to retrieve it. He glanced at it and smiled. Is this your wife? No. Graf didn't like seeing it in the SS man's hands. She was my girlfriend. Was? Bivak put on the professionally sympathetic face of an undertaker. I'm sorry. He handed it back. Graf carefully returned it to his wallet. He could tell Bivak was expecting a fuller explanation, but he did not want to provide one. The barrier lifted. The road with its ornamental street lamps stretched ahead, crowded on either side by trees. Once a place for a stroll or a bicycle ride, now shrouded overhead by camouflage netting. At first it looked empty, but as they penetrated deeper it became apparent that along the tracks running off to the right and the left, the woods concealed the main business of the regiment. Tents for storage, tents for testing, Scores of vehicles, a dozen missiles wrapped in tarpaulins and hidden beneath the trees. Shouts and the throb of generators and engines revving carried on the damp air. Vivek had stopped asking questions and was striding ahead in his eagerness. The land to their left fell away. Through the branches a lake glinted, dull as pewter, with an island and an ornamental boathouse. As they rounded the sweep of a bend, Graf raised his hand to signal they should stop. 200 metres on, in the centre of the lane, hard to distinguish at first because of its ragged green and brown camouflage, a V2 stood erect on its launch table, solitary apart from a steel mast to which it was attached by an electrical cable. Nothing moved around it. A thin stream of vapour vented silently from above the liquid oxygen tank, condensing in the misty air like breath. It was as if they had come across some huge and magnificent animal in the wild. Bivak instinctively dropped his voice and said quietly, "Can't we go closer?" "This is as far as is safe," Graf pointed. "Do you see the support vehicles have withdrawn? That means the firing crew are already in their trenches." From his raincoat pocket he pulled out his ear defenders. "You should wear these." "What about you?" "I'll be all right." Bivak waved them away. "Then so shall I." A klaxon sounded. A startled game bird, it must be a real survivor, Graf thought, as the soldiers liked to shoot them to supplement their rations, struggled out of the undergrowth and took clumsy flight. Its hoarse, panicked cry as it flapped noisily down the road echoed the note of the klaxon. Graf said, "She weighs 4 tons empty, 12.5 fueled. On ignition, the fuel is gravity-fed. That yields 8 tons of thrust, still lighter than the rocket." A voice carried over a loudspeaker. 10, 9, 8... Sparks, vivid as fireflies in the gloom, had begun cascading from the rocket's base. Suddenly they coalesced into a jet of bright orange flame. Leaves, branches, debris, dirt whipped into the air and flew across the clearing. Graf turned and shouted at Vivek, "Now the turbo pump kicks in. Thrust goes to 25. 3, 2, 1. His last few words were lost in the sharp-edged crackling roar. He clamped his hands to his ears. The umbilical cable fell away. A mixture of alcohol and liquid oxygen, forced by the turbo pump into the combustion chamber and burned at a rate of a ton every seconds, produced, so they claimed at Peenemünde, the loudest sound ever made by a man on Earth. His whole body seemed to tremble with the vibration. Hot air buffeted his face. The surrounding trees were brilliant in the glare. Like a sprinter poised on her starting block a split second after the pistol was fired, the V2 at first appeared stalled. Then abruptly she shot straight upwards, riding a 15-meter jet of flame. A thunderous boom rolled from the sky across the wood. Graf craned his neck to follow her, counting in his head, praying she would not explode. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. At exactly 4 seconds into the flight, a time switch was activated in one of the control compartments, and the V2, already 2,000 meters high, began to tilt towards an angle of 47 degrees. He always regretted the necessity for that maneuver. In his dreams, she rose vertically towards the stars. He had a last glimpse of her red exhaust before she vanished into the low cloud towards London. He let his hands drop. The wood was quiet again. The only residue of the V2 was a distant drone, and very soon even that stopped. Then there was only bird song and the patter of rain on the trees. The firing platoon had started to emerge from their trenches and were walking towards the firing table. 2 men wearing asbestos suits moved stiffly like deep-sea divers. Slowly Bivak took his hands from his ears. His face was flushed, his eyes unnaturally bright. For the first time that morning, the National Socialist Leadership Officer, seemed incapable of speech. So, if you're looking for a male, British English voiceover for your next project and you think my voice fits the bill, head on over to my Fiverr gig and book a slot. Here's the link again. I look forward to hearing from you soon.